So it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be invited. I think as the solo diagnostic company, I thought that my role was to convince you of the importance of diagnostics, but I can actually go back to my seat because I think the previous speaker from DND did my job for me. Because what she said was if we only had a good diagnostic test for leishmaniasis, we wouldn't have to be doing splenic taps. If we only had a good test for sleeping sickness, we wouldn't have to do lumbar punctures. And so everybody knows that you need diagnostic tests, but they tend to be ignored until it's too late. And then everybody goes, well, where are they? We don't have them. So as a diagnostic company trying to get involved and more involved in NTDs, bioMérieux is one of the few diagnostic companies in the world that's involved only in almost always, most of our tests are in infectious diseases microbiology, and that's very rare to be that focused. And it's a big company, and we're in a lot of countries, and many of the countries have NTDs. And we have a lot of industrial sites, including in Tres Cantos next to GSK. So I was interested to see that. And we have some research going on in Chagas. So these are, diagnostics in NTDs are extremely important, as you know. So I'm going to try to not just tell you how important they are, but how really important they are. So we put in a lot of R&D into diagnostics, much more than the benchmarking for other diagnostic companies. But this is the classic thinking. The classic thinking, and everybody knows the London Declaration. The London Declaration was to ensure necessary supply of drugs, drug access, R&D for treatments and interventions, collaborations, funding for endemic countries for programs, support endemic countries, and monitor progress. And in case you haven't noticed, there's no diagnostics in there. So what about diagnostics? Well, it wasn't included in the initial London Declaration. It was an addition of diagnostic companies this year, actually, for the first time we were there. And even you've heard from EDCTP, even at the EDCTP stakeholder meeting last year, they said the identification of biomarkers for diagnostics is a leading priority, but everybody still tends to invest in the therapies and in the programs. So what role why do we need diagnostics in NTDs? And the answer is, well, let's look at some facts. The treatment at large, which is being done with the 50-cent packs and very successfully and really a brilliant program, nobody argues that. The treatment at large of these entire communities is a very ambitious and successful program, but it's a program in the short term. It is not a durable approach for eradicating NTDs because there will always remain a small reservoir of infected individuals with many of these NTDs. Large-scale treatments are more likely to promote development of drug resistance. And every time you look through all these programs, there's always, well, there's a fear of drug resistance, there's a fear of drug resistance. We haven't seen parasitic drug resistance for years because these patients haven't been exposed to a lot of treatments, and there aren't a lot of treatments available. But now that we're giving wide-scale treatments in communities, it is very likely that parasites will follow all the models of viruses and bacteria elsewhere, and they will become resistant. Now, whether it happens overnight, very quickly, or whether it happens slowly, we have yet to see. As well, when you go in and treat large communities, you're obviously treating patients who are not infected as well, individuals who are not infected. So by giving these large-scale treatments and continuing to do that, you're going to be treating more and more uninfected people needlessly. And then from a health economics point of view, at some point it's going to become more economical to target people than it is to go in and treat whole communities as the incidence and prevalence of disease goes down. So for many NTDs, and this is different than, say, for pneumonia or meningitis, for many NTDs, infected individuals are without obvious or specific symptoms. And the only way you're going to know who's infected, you see pictures of filariasis and the end stage, but that's the end of disease. If you really want to know who's infected with filariasis asymptomatically, you're going to have to do a diagnostic test. And therefore, finding those infected people for targeted therapy is going to rely on diagnostics. It's plain and simple. It's going to rely on diagnostics after the mass treatment campaigns, like for soil-transmitted helminths, to move to a targeted therapy approach. And it's also going to have to be used after vaccination campaigns. Even if the malaria vaccine is effective, there are going to be small reservoirs of lowly infected individuals that will have to be treated and found and treated in order to remove that reservoir from further propagation. And that brings us to the first role of diagnostics, which is to move from this this mass therapy to targeted therapy, okay, which is going to happen at some point. And you're going to have to know who's infected. You're going to need diagnostics. The additional roles for diagnostics are more theoretical, but they're there. So diagnostics research, because we do R&D, we don't just create a diagnostic test. And again, there's a schism between pharma and diagnostics. We get approached by pharma companies to say, oh, we need a diagnostic test for this pathogen or that pathogen, and we're starting phase 3 studies next month. Can we have that test? And we go, well, it takes a little bit longer than 1 month to come up with a diagnostic test. Even if it's molecular based, it takes us a little bit, and immunoassays take us 6 to 9 months. And there's a lot of R&D that goes into this. So if there's going to be there's a lot of diagnostic R&D going on, and these have important instruments within the R&D groups that come up with unique antigens and components of these pathogens that could also be used coincidentally to develop vaccines and to monitor effectiveness of those vaccines. As well, those unique antigens and components, as you've heard already, can be the target of novel therapeutics. And it wouldn't be the first time that a research and R&D project in diagnostics comes up with a unique target that can be used for therapeutics. The additional roles for diagnostics are that they'll be needed to conduct surveillance. Surveillance is key. You need to know what's going on with the disease in order to address it. And in order to know what's going on, you need surveillance. Surveillance both for infection, and again, at the EDCTP stakeholder meeting, it was stated that for some diseases, and you've heard this again this afternoon and this morning, we don't understand the real natural history of this disease in the community. And we're going to need diagnostic surveillance in order to help us, because for many of these, the signs and symptoms are not clear. Diagnostic tests, more importantly, will be needed both pre and post these programs in order to check for resistance. We will not know that these parasites have become resistant until we start doing resistance testing. And let me tell you that resistance testing of parasites and parasitic infections and many of these NTDs is not as simple as doing bacterial resistance testing. And you can see the models that have been developed to just in vitro to test for malaria resistance, and not to rely on hourly blood tests on somebody who's been treated as a proxy for whether it's resistant or not, because there's many other factors that go into that. But a real in vitro test of malaria resistance is on the brink of being discovered and is yet to be validated. So that's for malaria, where there's been a lot of energy and money being pumped into it. Resistance markers and resistance in vitro determinants for Chagas, for Leishmania, for trypanosomiasis, these have yet to be validated for many of these. So this is not going to be such an easy task, but it's going to have to be done if we start sounding the alarms that they're becoming resistant to our treatments. Now, there are obstacles for diagnostics that are the same for therapeutics and different than therapeutics. So the obstacles for diagnostics that are similar to therapeutics are that we need a good supply of affordable diagnostic tests, just the same way you need a good supply of therapeutics. You need access programs. You have to get them out into the bush, into the villages, the same way that you need to get drugs out there. There has to be R&D, there has to be international collaboration, there has to be money, has to be funding, and there has to be support for the countries, right? However, there are unique obstacles for diagnostics that do not exist or relatively minor for therapeutics. Diagnostic tests for reservoir animals and insect vectors may not be the same as for infected humans. If we look at many of the other infectious diseases, our diagnostic tests for cattle and for sheep and for detecting certain pathogens in insects is not the same as the ones we use in humans, and they don't perform the same. So that means that if we really want to go through the whole cycle and test both the vector and the humans and see where the reservoirs are, and if we've eradicated the disease, we're going to need different diagnostic tests for each of these hosts. For some diseases, there are relapses and there are reinfections. So we're going to have diagnostic tests that can be able to tell the difference between these. Not so easy. Everyone wants new tech assays. Everybody wants molecular, everybody wants something sophisticated, everybody wants isothermal PCR, but these are usually costly platforms, okay? We have to start investing in low-cost devices. And even though it's new technology, that there isn't an associated high cost associated with it. There are regulatory issues. They're a little bit less than in pharma, but there are still regulatory issues that vary by every country. There's a need, as you saw, with the motorbike going out into the village, there's a need for point-of-care testing out in the community. And many of these communities, it's the patient themselves who's going to be testing themselves. So you need these very easy point-of-care tests, which for many diseases do not exist today. More than pharma, these tests have to be very robust. They have to be able to function during high heat, cold, high humidity, low humidity. The drugs need a cold chain, vaccines need a cold chain, but then once they're administered, they're administered. These diagnostic tests sit around in shelves in labs out in the countryside. And the temperature can go up to 45 degrees with 90% humidity, or it can drop down to 5 degrees and 0% humidity. And these diagnostic tests have to be robust. Not such an easy thing for a diagnostic company to make. They have to have long shelf lives because they're not going to be used in one day. They're going to be sitting around. The healthcare personnel has to be trained. It's one thing to train somebody to give a package of pills. It's another thing to train somebody to do PCR. Not quite the same training. I think everybody knows that who's been in a lab. Lab facilities are going to be required for large-scale training, so we're talking about point-of-care testing for the individual, but when you want to go in and do surveillance, if you want to go into an area and say, okay, how much artemisinin resistance is there in this area, you can't do this out in the community. You're going to have to do this in a central lab. There's going to have to be central lab facilities. And to tell you the truth, there aren't many companies in diagnostics working on infectious diseases. There's us and a couple of others, and there's not a lot of players. Now, it's great for our bottom line in terms of profits, but there isn't a lot of synergy among all our companies that are working in diagnostics, and there's not a lot of companies that want to invest in this because the margin is really low. So, a closing thought is we've been talking about NTDs, 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 and I can't leave this without saying something about antibiotic-resistant infections, which are not currently included in the NTDs, although you saw from the European consortium that they did include lower respiratory tract infections. MDR infections have reached a global crisis, as you heard from the WHO recently. We don't need the WHO to tell us this. Addressing public health in a certain area, whether it's Africa, Asia, it doesn't matter. It's going to have to be a comprehensive approach to NTDs and to MDR pathogens. So if you just look, there are very high rates of resistance in many bacteria in the same countries. NDM in India became famous essentially because of the multi-drug resistant infections that were found in the surveillance that was on there. But this occurs, China has a tremendous amount of drug resistance. Many of the Eastern European countries have tremendous drug resistance in tuberculosis and other infections. Speaking of TB, there's lots of multi-drug resistant TB. It is increasing almost everywhere you look. There's drug resistance in malaria. Now artemisinin resistance has been noted in Thailand and in significant proportions in certain areas. This is one of these resistances that did not develop slowly over time. It kind of developed quickly and then spread quickly, and in certain areas it's up to 85% of all the infections. So this is really a big threat to control programs. And then of course HIV drug resistance is increasing as well. The question is, will there be development of drug resistance among NTDs post MDA, or massive drug administration? And we don't know because MDA hasn't been around that long. But we will find out in the next few years, and we will see whether it happens like pneumococcus, where there's 1% resistance per year growing slowly, or whether like malaria and artemisinin, once it takes off, it takes off. And then it becomes clonal, or it becomes spread, or whatever. And we just don't know the model here. So the bottom line is that only diagnostic testing is going to be able to show a complete portrait of drug resistance, because you cannot tell when somebody walks in that they have a drug susceptible or a drug resistant infection. The infection looks the same. Severe malaria is severe malaria. Leishmaniasis is leishmaniasis. You can't tell what it's susceptible or resistant to until you do a diagnostic test. And that's where the real cornerstone is going to be in terms of surveillance after all these programs are successful or quasi-successful. So, in conclusion, diagnostics play a pivotal role in detecting asymptomatic infections, of which many NTDs are, targeting therapy to individuals that are infected instead of doing mass treatments, diagnosis of those infected reservoirs that remain after the control programs, surveillance of infections and drug resistance, pre and post programs, The diagnostic R&D projects may be an important tool for finding unique pathogen components for effective vaccines and therapeutics. And right now, diagnostics are the only means that we can use to detect, characterize, and follow multi-drug resistant infections globally, and including the NTDs if they become drug resistant. We are going to be wholly and completely dependent on diagnostics. Thank you.